There's a version of you that exists only in other people's minds. You've been feeding it your whole life, without even knowing it. Have you ever sent a message and then sat there watching the screen, waiting? Not because the information was urgent, not because anything depended on it, but because something in you needed to know how it landed, whether they liked it, whether they liked you. Or maybe it's quieter than that. Maybe it's the way you edit yourself before you speak, softening the edge off an opinion, adding a laugh to something serious, agreeing just a little more than you actually mean. You do it so fast now that you barely notice it happening. It's become the texture of ordinary life. You walk away from conversations, and something in your chest either relaxes or tightens, not based on what was said, based on how they seemed to receive you, whether their expression stayed warm, whether the room's energy shifted when you spoke. You're running an invisible calculation constantly on whether you are acceptable, whether you are enough. And the uncomfortable truth is, you've been doing it for so long that you've started to confuse it with just being a considerate person. But it's not the same thing. And somewhere underneath all the performance, you already know that. This isn't a character flaw. It's not weakness. It's not even something you chose. What happened is that at some point, probably very early, in a home or a classroom or a friendship that felt fragile, you learned that love was conditional, that warmth could be withdrawn, that who you were might not be enough, but who you performed yourself to be might be. And so you started building a version of yourself for public consumption. Agreeable, inoffensive, careful. A self shaped not from the inside out, but from the outside in, molded by whoever happened to be watching. And here's the part that makes it so hard to see. It worked. People liked that version. They approved of it. Teachers praised it. Friends felt comfortable with it. Relationships formed around it. So you kept going. You kept adjusting, kept softening, kept watching for the signals that told you whether you were safe. Not because you're weak, but because you were smart enough to learn the rules of a game you were never told you were playing. Carl Jung had a name for this. He called it the persona, the mask we build to face the world. Jung wasn't using the word as an insult. He understood it as something we all do, something that begins as a genuinely intelligent response to our environment. When you're a child, and the people who love you are unpredictable, building a careful presentation of yourself is survival. It's adaptation. It's the mind doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But Jung also noticed something that almost nobody talks about. He noticed that over time, the persona starts to do something dangerous. It starts to harden. What began as a mask you wore becomes a face you can't quite find your way behind. You forget which opinions are really yours. You stop knowing what you actually want in a room full of people because you've spent so long wanting what the room needs you to want. The distance between who you are and who you perform yourself to be quietly becomes the central wound of your life. And you can't quite name it, so you call it anxiety, or exhaustion, or just a vague sense that something is missing. Jung described this separation as one of the most painful things a person can experience. Not dramatic pain, not the kind that announces itself. The slow, grinding kind. The kind that shows up as a hollowness after social events you should have enjoyed. The kind that makes praise feel empty because you know it wasn't really you they were praising. The kind that makes relationships feel simultaneously close and somehow not quite real. Here's what he found, and this is the part that shifts everything. Jung believed that the compulsive need for approval doesn't come from caring too much about other people. It comes from not knowing who you are without them watching. The anxiety isn't about their opinion. It's about the terrifying silence that exists when their opinion is removed, and you're left alone with a self you were never taught to trust. That's the real diagnosis. You're not seeking approval because you're weak. You're seeking it because it has been functioning as your identity, a continuous external confirmation that you exist, that you matter, that your presence in a room is acceptable. Take it away, and there's a moment of free fall, and you've been avoiding that free fall your whole life. Now here's the thing that most people never reach, the part that changes how all of this looks. Jung didn't see this pattern as a life sentence. He saw it as the beginning of something. He called the work of peeling back the persona the start of individuation, the slow, often uncomfortable process of becoming a whole person rather than a performed one. And what he discovered is that the moment you stop organizing your life around other people's approval, something extraordinary begins to happen. Not immediately, not dramatically, but something real, something you can feel. Stay with this. The first thing Jung noticed in people who began loosening their grip on approval was this. They became frightening to themselves, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, unsettling way. Because when you stop performing, when you let a moment pass without managing how you're being perceived, there's a gap, a silence. And into that silence rushes the question you've been running from your whole life. Who am I? When no one is looking. Most people fill that gap immediately. They reach for their phone, start a conversation, check whether someone has responded, find something to do. The discomfort is so familiar and so total that they don't even register it as avoidance. They just know they feel slightly more comfortable when they're occupied, when they're engaged, when someone is there. What they don't know is that the occupation itself is the problem. Because you cannot find a self, you keep drowning out with noise. Jung called this the first gate. Before any real change is possible, a person has to be willing to sit in the discomfort of not knowing who they are outside the performance, not knowing what they actually think before they've measured the room, not knowing what they want when no one is offering approval as the reward for choosing correctly. It feels like emptiness. But it isn't. It's the beginning of contact, the first moment in perhaps years where you are actually present with yourself rather than managing yourself for someone else. Think about the last time you were in a group conversation and you said something you didn't quite mean. Not a lie, something subtler, a shade of agreement you didn't fully feel, an enthusiasm you performed rather than felt. You probably didn't even decide to do it. Your mouth just found the version of your thought that would land best and delivered that instead. You've done this so many times. It happens below the level of conscious choice. And afterward, maybe there's a trace of something, not guilt exactly, but a faint flatness, like the interaction happened slightly to the left of where you actually are. That flatness is important. It's not nothing. It's the self registering the gap between what was real and what was performed. And Jung would say, pay attention to that flatness. It's not weakness. It's information. It's the part of you that hasn't consented to disappear trying to make itself known. The first insight is this: approval seeking isn't about other people at all. It never was. It feels like it's about them, about whether they like you, accept you, find you interesting, or worthy, or good enough. But underneath that, what you're actually doing is outsourcing the question of your own value. Because if you knew your own value, if it was something you carried internally, something you'd built a relationship with, you wouldn't need the external confirmation. You might still want it. Appreciation feels good. Connection feels good. But you wouldn't need it the way you currently do, the way oxygen is needed, the way the next hit is needed. The need is the tell. And what it's telling you is that somewhere along the way, you handed the verdict on your own worth to other people, and you never asked for it back. And this is where it gets darker. Because here's what happens when you build your sense of self on external validation. You don't just become dependent on approval, you become terrified of authenticity. The real you, the one with the actual opinions, the uncomfortable edges, the wants that don't perform well in public, starts to feel dangerous. Not just socially risky, but existentially threatening. Because if the real you is rejected, there's nothing left. You've got no inner ground to stand on. Rejection doesn't just sting. It confirms the deepest fear you've never quite spoken out loud, that without the performance, you are nothing. Jung watched this happen in people across decades of clinical work. The mask doesn't just protect you from others, it eventually imprisons you. And the more successful the mask, the more people love the performed version, the more praise it receives, the more relationships it builds, the more terrifying it becomes to risk dropping it. Success in the wrong direction compounds the problem. The warmth other people feel for your persona becomes a cage, because you know, somewhere quiet and private, that what they're warm toward isn't quite you. Have you ever been genuinely praised? Someone saying exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment, and felt a strange hollowness instead of satisfaction? Not gratitude, not warmth, but a peculiar absence of feeling that you couldn't explain. That's not ingratitude. That's the self recognizing that the praise landed on the costume, not on whoever's wearing it. If you're still here, you're already different from most people. Most people clicked away the moment this got uncomfortable. You didn't. That means something. The second insight is this: the persona you built wasn't wrong, but it has an expiry date. This is the part Jung emphasized, and almost nobody carries with them. He didn't say the mask is evil. He didn't say you were broken for building it. He said it was necessary. And then he said that at some point in adult life, what was once necessary becomes a limitation. The scaffolding that helped the building stand during construction becomes the thing blocking the light. The mask served you. In a childhood where love felt conditional, it kept you safe. In adolescence, where belonging was survival, it navigated impossible social terrain. In early adult life, it helped you perform in systems that reward conformity. Workplaces, institutions, relationships built on careful, mutual adjustment. It did its job. You needed it to. But you are reading this now, which means some part of you knows that the job is finished. Some part of you is exhausted by the maintenance, exhausted by the constant monitoring, the invisible calculation, the way you arrive home after a social event and feel not rested, but somehow depleted, like you were working the entire time, because you were. The performance is labor. And you've been clocking in every single day. The expiry date isn't an age. It's not a milestone. It's the moment when the cost of maintaining the mask exceeds whatever protection it's still offering. And for many people, that moment has already come. They're just still paying the cost out of habit because they don't know what the alternative looks like. Jung said the alternative isn't the absence of a persona. You'll always have a face you show the world. That's not the goal. And it never was. The goal is to build that face from the inside out, rather than from the outside in. To let your values, your actual wants, your genuine responses to the world be the thing that shapes how you engage, rather than letting other people's potential reactions be the architect of everything you say and do. Most people never reach this, not because they couldn't, but because what comes next is what almost nobody talks about, and it's the part that actually changes everything. The third insight is the one that breaks the whole pattern open. Approval seeking is not a behavior. It's a relationship with uncertainty. This is what makes it so persistent, so resistant to simple solutions. You've probably tried to stop seeking approval before. You've told yourself to care less, to stop checking, to be more confident. And it works. For a moment, in a context where the stakes feel low. But then something matters. Someone whose opinion lands heavily enters the room, and the old calculation starts up again before you've even noticed. Because you weren't dealing with the behavior. You were trying to suppress the symptom while the root stayed untouched. The root is this: you cannot tolerate not knowing. Not knowing whether you're liked. Not knowing whether what you said landed well. Not knowing whether you're acceptable in this room, to this person, in this moment. The uncertainty feels unbearable, so the approval seeking is simply the most available way of resolving it. Get the signal. Get the nod, the laugh, the warmth, the like. The uncertainty closes. You can breathe again, until the next moment. Jung saw this clearly. He called it a fundamental failure of self-trust, not self-esteem in the shallow sense, not confidence or bravado, or the belief that you're impressive. Self-trust in the deeper sense, the capacity to remain yourself inside uncertainty. To let a moment be unresolved without collapsing into the need to fix it with someone else's approval. To say something and then let it sit in the air without immediately scanning for how it was received. Think about what it would feel like to send a message and then genuinely not think about it again. To walk away from a conversation and feel complete. Not because you got the warmth you were hoping for, but because you said what was true. And that was enough. To disagree with someone in a room and feel the discomfort of that without immediately softening it into agreement. Not because you don't care, but because you've found something to care about more, the truth of your own inner life, and the slow, imperfect, deeply real project of living from it. That is what Jung meant when he talked about individuation, not perfection, not fearlessness, not the absence of wanting connection or warmth or belonging. He meant the capacity to be yourself first, and then to offer that self to the world, rather than asking the world what self to be. So what actually changes? When you stop, not perfectly, not all at once, but genuinely begin to loosen the grip, what happens? The first thing is almost always discomfort. That needs to be said plainly, because most content about transformation skips this part. And then people try to change and feel the discomfort and assume they're doing it wrong. You're not doing it wrong. The discomfort is the process. When you stop filling the silence with performance, when you let a moment land without managing it, when you say something true instead of something safe, there is a beat of exposure, a moment where you are simply there, unprotected, unendorsed. And every instinct you've trained over decades is going to tell you that this is dangerous. It isn't dangerous. It's just unfamiliar. Jung wrote about this threshold at length. He described it as the moment the psyche begins to encounter itself, not the self it performed, not the self it presented, but the actual interior landscape that had been quietly waiting beneath all the management. And what most people find there isn't the emptiness they feared. What they find is something much more interesting. Opinions they'd forgotten they had, preferences that never made it past the internal censor, a quieter but more consistent sense of what feels right and what doesn't, a compass that had always been there, that they'd simply stopped consulting because other people's reactions felt louder. The second thing that changes is your relationships. This one surprises people. The assumption is that if you stop seeking approval, people will like you less. That the performed version, agreeable, careful, inoffensive, was the likable one, and the real one will be harder to love. Sometimes there's a period where this feels true. Some relationships do cool. Some people, it turns out, were comfortable with the performance precisely because it asked nothing of them. It never disagreed, never took up space, never presented an edge they'd have to meet. And when you start to take up your actual space, those relationships sometimes quietly contract. But here's what Jung saw happen consistently on the other side of that contraction. The relationships that remain, and the new ones that form, carry a weight and a warmth that the old ones never quite had. Because now there are two people in the room, not one person and their mirror. When you stop performing, you stop attracting people who need an audience. You start attracting people who want contact, real, specific, sometimes uncomfortable contact with another actual person. And that kind of connection, Jung believed, is what the psyche has been hungry for all along. Not approval, not warmth directed at a costume. Contact. Think about the people in your life who you feel most genuinely comfortable with. Not the ones who make you feel most approved of, the ones you feel most yourself around. Notice what's true about those relationships. Somewhere in their history, something real was risked. Something unpolished was allowed. Some version of you showed up that hadn't been pre-approved, and they stayed. That staying, that unconditional remaining, is what built the ground you can stand on with them. And it happened not because you performed better, because for a moment, you performed less. The fact that you made it this far tells me you're ready for what comes next. Because what comes next isn't a technique. It isn't a set of instructions. Jung was suspicious of people who wanted a system for becoming themselves. He thought the demand for a system was itself part of the problem. Another way of outsourcing the work. Another way of asking an authority to hand you the approved version of your own transformation. What comes next is a practice. A daily, imperfect, quietly radical practice of choosing your own response before you choose the one that will go down best. It begins small, almost embarrassingly small. It's noticing in the middle of a conversation that you're about to soften something true into something palatable and choosing not to. It's sending the message without rereading it 4 times for tone. It's sitting in the beat after you've said something real and not immediately walking it back. It's letting the uncertainty of how you were received exist without resolving it through an apology or a follow-up or a joke. None of this is dramatic. None of it announces itself. But Jung believed, and his clinical work supported this, that this quiet daily practice of choosing yourself accumulates into something. Not confidence in the shallow, performative sense. Something more like rootedness. A slow, private growing down of a sense of self that stops needing to be confirmed from the outside, because it's finally being built from the inside. And here is what Jung understood, at the deepest level, about what approval-seeking costs you. It isn't just energy. It isn't just authenticity. What it costs you, ultimately, is your life. Not in the dramatic sense, but in the most literal sense available. Every moment you spend calculating how to be received is a moment you are not actually living. You are managing a life instead of inhabiting one. And the tragedy, the one Jung returned to again and again in his work, is that this management happens so quietly, so continuously, so invisibly, that most people reach the end of their lives having been extraordinarily skilled at being acceptable, and having only glimpsed, in rare, unguarded moments, the person they actually were. You don't have to be one of those people. Not because you're special. Not because this video unlocked something that wasn't already in you. But because you've already demonstrated, right now, by sitting with this instead of clicking away, that some part of you is done with the performance. Some part of you is tired enough of the weight that it went looking for a different way to carry it. That part of you is not new. It has always been there. Underneath the careful self-editing, underneath the social monitoring, underneath the years of learning to read a room before you dared to be in it, there is a self that was never actually broken. It was just never given permission to be the one in charge. You are not a performance waiting for a better audience. You are a person waiting to meet yourself. That meeting doesn't happen all at once. It happens in the small moments where you choose truth over approval, presence over performance, your own unpolished reality over someone else's comfortable idea of you. It happens slowly, imperfectly, and with far more grace than you're expecting. Jung spent his life believing that the move toward wholeness, toward a self that doesn't need the mask to feel real, is the deepest work a human being can do. Not the easiest work, not the most comfortable, but the most irreversible. Because once you've tasted what it feels like to be actually yourself in a room, not performing, not calculating, not waiting for the verdict, you can't fully unknow it. The reference point exists. And everything else, every careful, managed presentation, starts to feel like what it always was, a substitute for something far better. If this reached something in you, it reached it for a reason. Drop a comment with the one thing that hit hardest. Let's build something honest here.